Hello, Simon. Thanks very much for joining me again on the show.
Karl, always a pleasure. Lovely to see your face. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. We had a great conversation. We're trying to work out before we started when it was,
Hmm.
and one week blends into the other. I think it was a few months ago, and there was some good feedback about that. Another few people have read your book and really enjoyed that. There was something that I heard you say on one of the podcasts a while ago, Simon, that I wanted to really pick up on because I think it's so relevant to a lot of people. And just to kind of set the scene, but for me with it, I was doing a talk the other night at a golf club, and it's a talk that I've done many times, and I have a sort of broad outline on slides and things like that. But I got there, and I won't go into all the details, but I looked at the audience and I thought this audience is not going to fit the kind of stuff that really I'm going to talk about here. And it was a bit of a leap of faith, but I kind of just went old school and went with the flip chart, abandoned the slides, and without too much no preparation for that. I just sort of started talking, and it was amazing how pleasurable it was for me, and it seemed to be that the audience responded really well to it. And I know you talked about that. You had a similar experience of that. Just go into your interpretation of that and your experience with the talk that led to your tour of America.
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about this just before we started recording, and I sort of skirted over this. So it's such an interesting topic and question. So, like you, I get given or I get asked to give a lot of talks, and generally speaking, I will know what I'm talking about. Understandably, because people want that. People want you to turn up with like, what are you going to be talking about? What are the key themes, etc.? Are they going to be takeaways that we can put into practice and so on? So it's understandable. But so in January, I was asked to go and give a talk to some people who are visiting from America. And I agreed because the person who was asking me has been a long time listener and supporter of my podcast, dating back to when it first launched on the BBC in 2018. Really fantastic guy, always tweeting out like really nice summaries of episodes and just really stood out as someone who's been a very loyal and impactful listener over the years. So I said, of course, I'll come. But because it was that more informal basis, I had no idea what I was going to say. It was completely impromptu. And I can still remember very vividly walking into this room, and all the audience was there and they were already talking and whatever else. And I remember being introduced, and I walked up and I sat down, and literally my mind was empty. I did not know what was going to come out of my mouth. And I couldn't even tell you what I spoke about. But what it did force me to do was be utterly present with the people I was with, the moment, and just sort of started talking. And it was a small enough crowd, still sizable, but it was a small enough crowd that I felt I could connect with each of them. And they were open. They were a really impressive group of young people as well. And I think it was just that connection, that presence, that spontaneity, all of that are aspects of, for example, flow, which is obviously something that I talk about so much. And and so yeah, it just really connected, and just it was like having just a normal conversation, a bit like we are now.
Yeah.
And and it just went down really well. And afterwards I went and had a drink with the organizers, and one of them spoke about, look, that was like watching flow. I mean, I'm not going to blow my own trumpet here, but one of them actually said that was a bit of a mystical experience. And it led to me, yeah, as I say, going on this tour of Texas, which was amazing, which we were talking about just before I got on air. So it, I would say that was probably one of my most, if not the most impactful talk I've given. And it was the one that I literally had no idea what I was going to say, literally, when I sat down to give it. So there's something there, isn't there,
There is.
about the moment and being truly present to the moment, present with who you're with, and kind of surrendering and just seeing what comes up.
And there is a leap of faith involved as well. There's a background of knowledge that you obviously have about that subject. You know, I couldn't have stood up the other night and talked about nuclear physics or anything like that. So
No.
I've got no idea what I'm talking about, but I have got some idea about this subject. But do you see this? I know you've been involved in sports for a long time, Simon, and I see it more and more, that in this world of sort of analysis and data and theories, it seems that an awful lot of people playing sport are so boxed in by theories and ideas and techniques of how you should do it, as opposed to just allowing yourself to respond, whether it's another team, another opponent, whatever the environment is.
I think that's absolutely right. And two things have come to mind. So I've got an episode out with Dominic Thiem, the 2020 US Open champion in tennis, and we were chatting about how he has that quite familiar phenomenon of having reached a pinnacle, a goal he was aiming for his whole life, and getting there and feeling ecstatic for a matter of weeks and then realizing nothing had changed. So that's something. But another thing we discussed was around the idea of positive thinking. And there's this clip that's been doing the rounds on LinkedIn recently. This guy, an Irish fella, I think, who was standing up in front of a class and makes this really bold claim that a university somewhere in America had done this study to find out what the difference between the top 5 tennis players in the world and the top 50 were. And he says, and do you know what it was? It wasn't the swing, it wasn't the equipment, it wasn't the fitness, it was how they spoke to themselves between points. And I immediately thought, what a load of nonsense. But it was one of those things that sounds
right, doesn't it?
Plausible,
yeah,
and sounds achievable. And so people love it. And so underneath this LinkedIn post, and I've seen it in a couple of places, everyone's like, oh, this is so true. How you speak to yourself is the most important thing, blah, blah, blah. But I just thought, how does this guy, how has anyone done the research around what a top 5 tennis player is saying to themselves at a key moment at Wimbledon or the US Open or Australia? It just doesn't happen. So there's that. And then also earlier this year, Novak Djokovic said in an interview when he was asked about his talent, his greatest talent, which was mental strength. And he stopped the interview and he said, I've got to correct you. It's not a talent. It's something I've worked at. And a big part of that is this realization that the idea that we should be positive all the time is a myth. And when you set up this idea that you have to think in a certain way, you have to have a certain mindset, all that stuff, then when it doesn't go that way, you then really slip into resistance and it causes problems. And so early in Djokovic's career, he thought he shouldn't be feeling fear. He shouldn't be feeling doubt. He shouldn't be berating himself in his mind. And that caused him problems. And it was only later he was like, no, I'm a human being. This is all very normal. And therefore, it's not the fact that I have these thoughts or these feelings, but it's my ability to not get lost in them, to observe them, and then to center myself within them as quickly as possible, which he did through training himself through just mindful breathing of his breath. So that to me is a classic example. I'm Dominic Thiem, by the way. I put this to him and he said, absolutely, he said, well, I gave the example of, as someone who plays tennis myself and played to a club standard, I could be playing with a friend in a social match. And if it's 5-all deuce on my serve and I got a second serve, I'll have the thought, I'm going to put this in the net or I'm going to hit it out or whatever. And I said, I'm imagining that still happens, when you're a pro. He said, absolutely. I had those doubting thoughts when I was 12 and I had them when I was playing in a Grand Slam final in front of 16,000 people. They never go away. But it's so easy to think that, oh no, we should think in a certain way. The pros don't have these doubts, or it's like the talk about imposter syndrome, as if everyone doesn't experience that at some point. And so that to me is a really good example of this boxing yourself in, as you said, of oh, this is the way I should be. But actually, no, everyone is just as messy as everyone else. But it's our ability to.
I would say, Simon, that sort of statement, that blanket statement about, the difference between top 50 players or whatever the statement was, is the way that they talk to themselves. in between shots. I would actually say that's quite dangerous in a way, because
Oh yeah.
it then creates a belief system that, as you say, I shouldn't have these thoughts and I should be able to control these thoughts. So you end up in a situation where the natural flow of experience is going across the screen of your mind, and you start freaking out trying to control that. It takes you further and further away from the task at hand. That cliche that is a cliche for a reason. It's very useful. And I remember a top player I worked with talked about, he was leading a big event, and he got 4 holes to play, playing some of the best golf of his entire life. And he said he was walking from the 14th green to the 15th tee. And he suddenly had a thought popped into his head that he was going to top it off the end of the tee. And he said his whole body started to shake. And, people don't think that top players have those thoughts. But they do, and he was shaking. He felt uncomfortable. He just thought he's probably not topped a shot off the end of the tee for 10 years, but suddenly his brain had come up with that thought. But he still managed to gather himself and attend to the task and hit a shot and win the tournament. So I think this idea of control, it's so pervasive, and so many people try and sell it, but it's actually quite dangerous, really.
Completely agree with you. And this is what I had really bad insomnia. I've spoken about this many times in my 20s, and I'd have these thoughts like, I'm not going to sleep tonight and tomorrow's going to be awful. And I would try and battle the thoughts one of two ways. One would be trying to change it. So if the thought said I'm not going to sleep tonight, I'd go, oh no, I will sleep tonight. It's perfectly feasible. So I'd be getting into this battle where I'm on both sides of the conversation, or I would just try and avoid it and ignore it, or pretend it wasn't there. So that's another form of suppression. And neither of them worked. And it was only when I was introduced to acceptance and commitment therapy and the diffusion technique, where you just add the prefix, I'm aware of the thought, or I'm having the thought, I'm not going to sleep tonight, which just creates that bit of space. And that for me was utterly transformative, because then it doesn't really matter what you think. Because I have a chapter in my book about people, growth mindset and fixed mindset. And people bang on about this all the time. But first of all, again, the evidence that actually doesn't back it up. They haven't been able to replicate the studies. But this idea that, you should have a growth mindset, or I'm not good enough yet. Of course, there's some value in that. But the fact is, our thoughts and our moods change all the time for so many factors. If we have a baby now, if she's not sleeping well, if we have a bad night, then I know my thoughts will be affected by how I feel. Whereas if I'm rested and I've had some sun and I've all that, so what thoughts come up we're not in control of them. I mean, the simple question: do you know what thought you're going to have next?
Yeah.
No. Well, then what gives you any idea that you can control them? And I agree with you. I think it's very dangerous, but so deeply rooted, and so such a sort of cultural unconscious limiting belief that we should be able to think in this certain way. But I agree with you. I think the more people who can come out and point out that, no, everyone's a human being, everyone feels these things at different times, it's totally normal, then I think the resistance to it would reduce and people would suffer a lot less.
And it's when the resistance reduces, you just get on with your day, metaphorically, don't you? Whether that day is a cup final or a job interview or whatever it may be, this idea of being in a perfect state puts so much pressure on yourself to actually try and then replicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If I think of having one of those, those nights sleep where you wake up and you really, I don't know how this is for you, Karl. So different people react to different ways. One of those night sleeps where I wake up and I'm like, God, that was a really good night's sleep. It doesn't happen that often, particularly with,
It's
2 kids and whatever else. But, I just, when you have had that and trying to cling on to that feeling, then it's, of course, enjoy it when it's there. God, there's no better feeling for me than, I don't know, having done some exercise one night and then having a great night's sleep, and you wake up and you've got full of energy. It's like, today's going to be a good day. But how often does that happen? I'd say for me, not that frequently. So, we've got to be able to crack on but without burning out as well. I think that's really important. Irrespective of what's going through our heads. I just a very quick story just to highlight this. So I talk about this quite a lot when I do my own talk. So I remember at London 2012, I was covering Super Saturday for 5 Live, and I knew there would be bosses listening. And it was when Jess Ennis, Greg Rutherford, Mo Farah won gold, and I was doing a live broadcast from the fans park, and I had this slight sensation of anxiety grow in my chest, which I interpreted as anxiety in my belly. And I just was like, oh, I don't want to feel you. Please kind of go away. I was trying to resist it. And what then happened was it rose up into my head, and I was having these catastrophic thoughts that I'm going to mess this up. I'll never work in broadcasting again, etc. As it happened, the adrenaline kicked in and I got through it fine, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. And it was when I learned exactly this idea that, or this recognition that at big moments you're going to have these feelings, then it completely changed things for me. And I remember a few years later being sat in the wings, ready to go on the Victoria Derbyshire programme, to be interviewed about a subject that was kind of out of my comfort zone. And I remember that very same feeling rising in my tummy. But this time, rather than, oh no, go away, I became interested in it. So kind of rather than resisting it, I actually went towards it.
You're curious about
welcomed it. And it alchemized really from a sense of anxiety and fear to one of excitement. And so I really enjoyed that performance as opposed to kind of spiraling off into a bit of a panic attack. So yeah, the way we respond to these inner feelings can have a big impact. Now, that's not to say by any stretch I've still got it right. Like, I get overwhelmed, particularly working on my own. And sometimes, I've got to go and take a break because my mind just gets overwhelmed with so many things going on. But I think having this recognition and knowing that it's normal and knowing that your mind's going to come up with different stuff and that you don't have to take it seriously is one of the most freeing recognitions you can have.
Yeah, yeah. And then you can get back to actually focusing on what it is that you enjoy doing without trying to be perfect in terms of your thinking process and in terms of this mythical perfect state. Just back to Dominic again, what I thought was fascinating, you just touched on it there about it was a very honest thing that he said about winning the US Open, and then for 4 or 5 weeks afterwards was everything was great, but then he realized that nothing really had changed, and it was a really quite depressive time for him to sort of process that. And we were saying before we started that we've both experienced that with people at the very, very highest level, achieving what you would think would be the ultimate in golf or tennis or cricket or whatever. But then there's an illusion to that. Again, what are your thoughts on that, Simon? I'm digging a bit deeper with this in terms of people listening, thinking, well, shouldn't you have dreams and goals and ambitions, and shouldn't you want to win Wimbledon or British Open or whatever? And if it doesn't mean anything when I get there, where do I go? What are your thoughts on squaring all those sort of? I know I've thrown a lot at you there, but
no, I like that. I mean, this is the essence of a new way of being. The name of my podcast, the name of my work. So the tagline to this is all about challenging what I call success evangelism.
Yeah.
And what I would say about success evangelism is this belief that when X happens, I'll be content and happy. The job, the house, the relationship, promotion. But it's particularly amplified when it comes to, for example, sport. Let's say in terms of a golf major or a Grand Slam title or an Olympic gold medal or a World Cup. But also when you see it now in terms of, for example, high performance culture, this the kind of these successful quote unquote people that we see put on pedestals, and oh wow, I don't want to name names, but the type of people you'll see doing the podcast rounds and stuff like that. And I think with a lot of this high performance culture, there is this underlying premise that, well, you're not enough now, but if you work your ass off like me, then you can become enough in the future. And so to me, I think the key recognition is that we are innately enough. And nowhere is this more obvious for me than with my 18-month-old daughter. And she just is utterly authentic. She has got no identity. There's none of that stuff. She just is herself. So when she's happy, she smiles. When she's sad, she cries. She's very present. And so she just, there's no question of her needing to do anything to prove her worth. Now, that is true of all of us, but we lose touch with that. And so I think it's very normal, and this was certainly true of me, to go on this expedition or this quest to become enough again. But you can't become what you already are. And so it's about, for me, I went the long way round. I did the whole self-improvement thing and NLP and positive thinking and yada, yada, yada. And it eventually led me to, and I know this is a loaded word, but a spiritual path. And fundamentally, that was, all I mean by that is really understanding that we are not who we think we are. We're not our thoughts. We're not our feelings and stuff like that. We are there before that. And so to me, it's about reconnecting with our innate enoughness, our innate wholeness, and recognizing that that can never be improved upon or diminished. And then once we see that, it doesn't mean we still don't have dysfunctional patterns or difficulties to work through, but it becomes much easier to work through them. But then also, it doesn't mean we can't try and achieve big things, whether it be a Wimbledon title or a Masters jacket or whatever it may be. But it's not then about trying to become enough in future. It's about recognizing we're all enough and then expressing that through however our body mind is wired to express that. And if that happens to be playing golf or tennis, then go for it. But just don't expect it to give you that lasting happiness or fulfillment or make you fill up a void inside or feel enough, because it can't possibly do that. Nothing outside of you can do that. It can only ever be about expressing this innate well-being and wholeness that we all have, but we just lose touch with because the ego comes online and it starts comparing and judging and conceptualizing and identifying, and we create this sort of persona that inevitably is lacking because it's limited, and then lose touch with this innate well-being that is our very nature. And so to me, it's just a difference between expressing it or seeking to become it, being it or becoming it. And I think so much high performance stuff is about becoming it in future, whereas I'd much rather the whole express that you're okay, express this recognition that you're whole already.
But again, Simon, it's something I've talked a lot about on this podcast, is when you're out there expressing your craft, whatever that craft may be, whether it's broadcasting, dentistry, tennis, or whatever. When you're expressing your craft, the environment that you're then in, the football field or the golf course, is occurring to your brain as a place of opportunity, not threat, isn't it? If you're out there and your self-worth is hanging on whether you manage to close out the major or you make the cut or whatever it is, when you're being defined by that, every shot is an opportunity to lose something against that perception, isn't it? So it's a very, very threatening place to be. And also then I think it feeds back into the daily existence, whereby I see this a lot with players, a lot with golfers, where this practice session is actually not about this practice session. This practice session is about, if this goes well enough, surely I'll then be able to take that into the tournament, or I'll be able to take this into the match, or whatever it is. As opposed to, I think genuinely, when you fall in love with the idea of being on a path to mastery, this session is about this session. This session is about refining your skills and refining your craft. And I think there's a big world of difference between the two.
Absolutely, there is. And I was just reminded, like, I'm quite interested in people who meditate and then have transformative / enlightenment experiences. And I'm reminded of one person, and he said, if you ever approach meditation, for example, with that view of trying to get somewhere, you'll never get anywhere. Yeah. And it's the same in sport. It's the same in anything. I got the train up to Manchester recently, and I was really struck by when I was under the board waiting for the train platform to be announced, and everyone's there.
The Euston Wait.
Hundreds of
the Euston Wait. Yeah, I've done it many times.
And everyone's there, and they're kind of restless, and it feels like dead time. But I mean, that's emblematic of this whole becoming rather than being. So that moment there where people are waiting for their train is merely a stepping stone to the more important moment of getting on the train, which is there a stepping stone to the more important moment of getting to where they want to go. But actually, I remember I was there and I was looking around and I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. I noticed there were cameras all around. You know, there were pigeons flying around. There was just actually a hell of a lot to take in. And I think as well, I remember sort of just thinking to myself, isn't it amazing that there's something rather than nothing? And I think we lose touch with this incredible insight, and therefore, want to rush through things to this better moment in future. But that better moment never arrives. It's only, every moment is kind of relatively mundane until you realize actually how miraculous every single moment is. Now, again, I'm not saying that I've nailed this by any stretch, but I'm a hell of a lot better than I used to be. The mundanity, when I'm zeroed in, the simple mundanity of walking literally, to the station, whatever, being on a train, whatever it might be, it's absolutely miraculous, but we lose sight of that. And then it becomes about this, the bigger thing. And yeah, like you say, there's something to lose rather than just enjoy in the moment. And one thing I would just add as well, in sport, people talk about it's the person who wants it most, which I think is another one of those nonsense cliches. Because actually, you think of someone like Rory, he really wants it. It's got nothing to do with how much he wants it. It's, I think what you pointed to, it's that sense of, actually, there's something to lose here. And that becomes potentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. But a rather crude analogy I like to use is, think back to your dating days, right? The person who got the most dates was not the person who wanted them the most. It was the person who wanted them the least. That then, you always act like a magnet. Yeah. So why would that be different in life or in sport or whatever? When you're willing to, it doesn't really matter whether or not it's not fundamental. You don't need to have whatever it is. Of course, there's more of a freedom straight away in your way of being, which makes it more likely.
I think that's I knew we'd get to some interesting subjects. I didn't think dating was going to be one of them.
I think it's a good example, that, right?
Yeah, it's a great example that I think somebody who's willing to accept that a person could say yes or no and be okay with that and metaphorically move on to the next option or the next possibility. That's freedom, isn't it? And this, as you say, what a stupid cliche it is. What a stupid statement. He wanted it more than the rest. Well, actually, if people buy into that, it just creates such tension and such pressure, in the sense that does that mean that if you want it so much, you're not prepared to deal with the fact that you could possibly lose? It's that I think, to me, it's that willingness to accept the multitude of potential outcomes and said, you know what, I'm still going to have a go anyway, whatever it is, from dating to hitting a golf ball.
Absolutely. There's a couple of quotes that spring to mind. So Jiddu Krishnamurti famously said this, and I quoted this in my book. I think it's his most famous utterance. He was sat in front of a big crowd of people and he said, do you want to know what my secret is? And they all thought, okay, here comes the golden bullet. I'm going to go in and really pay attention to this. And he said, it's very simple. I don't mind what happens. So that just means a complete acceptance of good and bad. And then you can move with freedom. It's like the Buddhist idea of attachment. By all means, want something or love things or treasure possessions and whatever else. But the moment you become too attached is the moment it becomes dangerous. And actually, I've heard people talk about this even in terms of close relations and stuff. And I'm still somewhat getting my head around that. But it does make sense to me, is actually even this idea that the more attached you're, if you can really let go of attachment, actually you can be even more loving, which is a really interesting idea. But yeah, I think that, anytime we cling on to things and resist things, that's when we run into trouble, because you can't have good without bad. You can't have up without down. You can't have left without right. It's inevitable that, down follows up follows down, etc., etc. So if we're only going to accept the ups but not the downs, then we're going to cause ourselves suffering. And most of us, all of us do that.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth pointing out that actually the more you can get in line with just how things are moment to moment, then even being reminded of that is super helpful. And then also remembering that ultimately we're all going to die. So, the worst thing is going to happen. So you might as well take some of
It's
the
a
other
brief
stuff in the
visit
way.
at best, isn't it?
Exactly.
Just on that and the sort of philosophical element to it and the spiritual side that you mentioned. I know I think we touched on non-dualism last time, and I know you spent time with Rupert Spear, who's been on this podcast. We've had a discussion, I think, in the past. We touched on the idea of non-dualism. To me, is an ultimate truth. Is that at a quantum level, it's just a sea of nothingness, and we are all connected and all the rest of it. And you get some people in the non-dual world who are very anti any kind of technique, and you shouldn't do anything like that. But my problem is that then we have to exist in the real world, don't we? We have to go and get the train at Euston. We have to be there at 5 to 5 to get the train to Manchester or whatever. What's your take on that of an understanding of non-dualism, but then bringing it to a practical application in the real world?
I completely agree. I don't like that view at all. It doesn't work for me. I know that meditation, for example, has real value. Self-inquiry has real value. Physical practices, trauma release exercises. My wife is a Reiki master, and I tell you, I've had some of my outside of psychedelics, I've had my most profound experiences with her. Just so I think this idea of, I completely disagree with it. And a really interesting guy is a guy called Gary Weber, who's got a book called Happiness Beyond Thought. And he is someone I think who's gone the whole way, in that he just did huge amounts of self-inquiry, yoga, and all this stuff. And then his narrative self, his ego, just got snuffed out. And so he directly addresses this point of not needing to practice, as it were, and says it's a nonsense. And I very much am in that school of thought. Now, you might get to a point down the line where you realize it was never you doing it, but that's different. Like most of us, that is not our experience. We still feel like the doer. And so this idea of, it's just happening. Well, in which case, get on and do some practice. But it's that paradox of, only a seeker will find, but at the same time, seek and you won't find kind of thing. And so to your point, I agree. There's this, it's almost like these two parallel levels of existence. There's the, let's say, absolute level of complete connection. We're all one. And I don't doubt that at all.
No.
And my own experiences have borne that out very much so. I don't doubt that in the slightest, and it's had a huge impact on the way I live, the way I try and behave around other people, all sorts of stuff. And it's such an important recognition for me. But at the same time, we're also, as you say, we're human beings, and we are here, and we do feel spirit, and we have to go and get trained, and we have to earn a living, and we have to do all the normal human stuff. And so to me, it's honoring both levels of existence. And actually, I find that they are complementary. So, for example, I've had some patterns around shame and feeling bad because I was told off a lot growing up. I was naughty, gobby, so-and-so. And so there's this quite deep-rooted pattern of I'm bad and shame. And I used to find that so difficult to feel. But because I think having touched into this, that what we spoke about there, the loving, aware presence that is the fundamental, in my view, nature of things, then when those patterns now come up, it's safer to feel them. And actually, I want to feel them because if they don't get felt, they stay stuck. So actually, I find these two planes of existence are really complementary. On the one hand, this aware presence side, and that gives living a depth, for one. Also means that when difficult things come up, it's far safer in a way. Um, and it sort of swings to and fro. So look, I'm completely with you. I don't like that school of thought of not doing anything at all. I completely disagree with that. I think most people who I value agree with that.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's about honoring both.
Yeah. It's like there's an absolute truth and there's a relative truth, isn't it? That wherever you are,
Absolutely.
you've got to deal with what the issues that are confronting you. So what would you then say now if you were sort of helping somebody in broadcasting, for if they were starting off in the broadcasting world? Because you must have experienced that. It must be a challenging environment, I would have thought, with all the sort of egos and all the rest of it, and the rewards that can be there. What's your sort of outside in view of the world of broadcasting now? I know that's a grand question, but
Well, it's a good one because very recently the BBC had a cultural review after various scandals, and the Director General gave an order, as it were, that the word talent wasn't to be used anymore.
right.
And this again, this was something I wrote about in my book, is I've I've railed against the word talent for a long time because I can't stand it, because it implies that the talent is talented, and if you're not the talent, that means you're not talented.
Mm,
But someone who's on screen can't get on screen without the producers and the editors, and so it's just a different skill set.
mm,
But I do agree that um, I've seen the talent, um, or people who have of particularly high status behave pretty badly,
right.
and pretty embarrassingly, actually. I've got a few images in my mind now. And oftentimes it's understandable because they have people around them blowing smoke up their backside,
Yeah.
telling them how wonderful they are, and they believe it.
Yeah.
And then they behave accordingly.
Mm,
And it's tragic, and it's, in my view, inexcusable in many cases. Not inexcusable, but like shouldn't be accepted as it is. And so my advice to anyone would be that whatever you do, whatever you achieve, nothing actually changes. You're
no.
still that same essence
Mm,
that you came into the world as. Yeah, your knowledge might change, the level of approval might change, but it's so fickle and fleeting. You only have to look back 30 years. You think of who was famous then, Phil Collins and Madonna and people like Michael Jackson, right?
mm,
And then you fast forward it 20 years, and the way people are viewed have completely changed.
completely.
So it's so arbitrary and fickle
And
and
temporary.
empty. Yeah, and temporary, exactly. That, if you fall for that, then you're going to suffer, I think. And so I argue in the bit, like, why should you treat anyone differently on account of what they do?
Yeah.
Why should you treat a celebrity or a sports star different than someone serving you in a shop or in a restaurant? Like, at a fundamental level, there's no difference.
Mm,
And so my advice would be to not get swept up in all that crap, and not to let it go to your head, or think that, or believe that you're any less than, because it works both ways. It's not just, oh, I'm better than another. If you think I'm lesser than another, that's just the ego in another form.
yeah.
Uh, and so I bumped into a girl I used to work with, and she was talking about, so she's a reporter, and she was talking about her husband, her partner, fiance, who's a lawyer, and how there were perks and downsides to both of their jobs. He was earning more money and he had more time on the golf course. And she said, but he knows this is my vacation and it's my identity. And I wanted to jump in and say, what do you mean it's your identity?
Mm,
Like, it shouldn't be your identity. This
mm,
idea of identity is just a load of old codswallop.
mm,
It's something you do. It's not who you are.
yeah.
I really don't like any idea of, oh, I've got an identity and you need an identity. Like, why?
No, you don't.
Why? My baby daughter does not have an identity, and she does very well for herself and is very popular. Let me tell you, when I take her around the shops and stuff like that. But we start thinking that we need to have an identity. It's really important, but it's just a blooming story we tell ourselves that we've made up. Even the fact that I'm British or my dad's Scottish or whatever, it's all made up. It's
Mm,
not actually blooming real,
no.
And so just taking it all with a pinch of salt and not letting any of it go to your head, and realizing it's just a way to navigate the social landscape is an insight that once you see through it, you think, crikey, we are absolutely bonkers. But very few people, don't think that things like that are really important. So you can see why they get swept up in it.
And when you have an identity like that that's attached to an endeavor, a sport, or a vocation, it's inherently fragile, isn't it? Because if anything goes wrong within that environment, that identity gets crushed.
Absolutely. And yeah, you hear about it all the time. Sporting people who, when they retire, they really struggle.
Yeah.
And that's inevitable. Is if this is who I am, well, then when you stop being that, then people say, well, who am I? Well, you're exactly the same as you always were. But I think it can be even more subtle than that. So I'm quite sensitive. We were talking before we started recording about our respective sort of strengths, and like I'm not very good. I'm not very practical, for example. My father is very practical, and he was an engineer, and so he's different than me.
Yeah.
Now, I spend time with my dad, and sometimes I love it, and sometimes I don't love it so much. And I'll give you a very clear example. So recently, I took him for his birthday to a brewery. I like doing experiences. He doesn't need any more things, so I take out. It tends to be booze related, and we go and we have a fantastic time because we are in that moment. We're just meeting as two adults, two people, as Carl Jung said, to just meet another human as a soul, right? So we're on the level. But then sometimes the dynamic will flip and he will go into his an identification with being dad.
Dad.
Right. And so he relates to me through that prism. Have you done this? What's going on with this? What about this? And then I will often then react to become teenage Simon, resistance. And it becomes really dissatisfying and inauthentic and unpleasant. And so first, I'm not having a go at my dad here, but I have to sort of put down some boundaries and say that sod off, don't come around. Our relationship is more important than whether or not I've frigging put up a fence or something like that. And so I think it can be even that subtle when you identify with I'm a dad or I'm an adult. When you speak to a child, oh, I'm an adult, and therefore I've got to speak to them as an adult. No, just relate to anyone. I think just from that, as we said at the beginning, that impromptu, no agenda, just open, see what comes out. Why speak to anyone differently? A 5-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 55-year-old, a celebrity, someone working in a restaurant. Of course, like you would adapt what you say, but it can still come from exactly the same place, this exact recognition that you're no higher than or lower than anyone, irrespective of their status, their age, their role. It does not matter. And I think for me, that's been the most valuable thing, I think, to come from the non-dual side of things as well, is that, and therefore be able to, as far as possible, enter any interaction open-hearted and stay open, and therefore connect quite easily with people, because it's just why I don't think I treat anyone really differently. Doesn't matter if I've just met someone in a shop, just met them in the street, through to my blooming wife or my family or friends. Of course, what we talk about different, but the energy is the same, and there's no need for it not to be. Like why? Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. I hope you know what I'm doing.
Can you put fences up though?
No, I'm bloody useless. Don't you start, Dad. I'll get resistance.
I think there's. It just reminded me when you were talking about that. So I remember working with a player he'd been in contention a few times in tournaments, and he would dread the interview, the sort of after the Saturday round, where they would say, oh, what do you think you're going to need tomorrow, and what score's going to win it, and what would it mean, how much would it mean to you if you won that event? These questions that I just sit there and I listen to some of these questions, and I think, have you not anything better than that? And we used the tactic for a while, and it was quite interesting on some of the interviews where you just started to say, well, let's just see what happens. And it kind of like completely diffused the question, and it was a tough one for an interviewer. But for him, it was not quite. It was very liberating. Let's see what happens.
And it's the true blooming answer as well. It's the true answer. I mean, how can it's like saying what's going to happen tomorrow? I don't know, but I'll find out tomorrow. that always used to drive me crazy in sports sporting, is when people say, "Oh, give us a prediction for the match," and it only happens in football. Oh, it's going to be 3-2, 2-1. It's like saying, all right, you might as well finish an interview and say, "Okay, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100. Tell me what it is." Just,
Yeah.
it's a punt in the dark, and people don't do it at other sports. It's like saying at the beginning of the Masters, "Oh, what do you think Rory's going to go round in?" "Oh, I think he's going to go round in a 64, 72." It's just such a nonsense, sort of Alan Partridge-esque question. And that's ultimately why I started the podcast back in 2018, called it "Don't Tell Me the Score," for this
Right.
exact reason.
Right.
Because I was like, I just am so bored of the shallowness, the shallow level of the questions and stuff like that. I completely agree with you. It's so lacking. And so yeah, anyone who does ever have to go do those interviews, absolutely, that's what you should say. I don't know. Do you know? You know?
Yeah, yeah.
If you do, let me know.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me what's going to win the 330 at Kempton while you're at it as well.
Exactly. Back to the Future.
Yeah. So what would your definition, Simon, be, just to kind of round things off? It's a phrase I use a lot, a path with a heart. What for you is a definition of a path with a heart?
Path with the Heart. Well, two things I would say. One is that ability to stay open-hearted and connected even during difficult moments. And I'm thinking of our eldest daughter, even when we are telling her, "Put your shoes away, you've done something naughty," it doesn't mean that you can't still stay open-hearted and connected. And so for me, having that energy, that open-hearted connection with as many people, even in the face of difficult moments, because our hearts do tend to shut. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing I would say is around reconnecting with that innate enoughness and wholeness that we all have, and discovering what our gifts are, and then expressing them in the world. And it doesn't have to be on some grand scale. I'm reading this lovely book at the moment. I think it's called The Mutant Messenger Down Under, and it's about Aboriginal culture, and it's full of wonderful lines. And one is about exactly this: is that everyone has a gift, and that gift can change over the course of a lifetime, but then can you express it? And if you only help one person, that's enough, because you can only help one person at a time anyway. And so, we want to be able to scale and do things on such grand scales, but actually, if you play the guitar and you go on a bridge and only get £3, whatever, it doesn't matter the scale, but just expressing all our gifts as best we can, in this world, which makes it somewhat difficult. I think that would be a nice definition. So two things, keep staying open-hearted, and then expressing our gifts, expressing our, as I say, enoughness, our wholeness in what we do as best we can within the limits of what is capable in society, and with having to pay the bills, which is not always easy at this time, and all that kind of stuff. But those would be my two definitions.
And I think, as we've said all the way along, it does warrant asking some questions, doesn't it, about the constant propaganda, I suppose, that we're being fed by these cliches of want it more and all this kind of stuff that we've talked about. You have to ask a few deeper questions, don't you, and go a little bit beneath the surface.
You certainly do, Karl, and I think you do that really lovely. And I'll just share a little news flash with you, as it were. I've got a podcast coming out soon with the Danish guy. He's called Mike Viking. Great name. And
what a fantastic name.
And he wrote the very famous, or the very successful book, The Little Book of Hygge, spelled Hygge, which is about the Danish approach of getting cozy. And so Denmark consistently tops polls for being the happiest country in the world. And a big part of that is down to the fact that they don't value status. So if you drove around with a Lamborghini, people wouldn't be like, "Oh, that's impressive." It's more like, come on, mate. Like, so any kind of ostentatious show of get me is just not appreciated culturally. And to me, it's no coincidence that there is this disdain for embracing status, and then also there's this recognition that they're okay to pay slightly higher taxes or whatever, because then they get better primary schools and they support people throughout society. So it's a lot more of a we culture than a me culture. It's no coincidence as well that coincides with the fact that they're happy, that they tend to be the happiest country in my view. So this guy, Mike Viking, came on and I said, can I just do a little thought experiment with you? He said, yeah, sure. And I said, in Denmark, it's a bit scandalous here. I'm going to sound a bit bitchy, but that's okay. In Denmark, how do you think podcast called the High Performance Podcast or the Diary of a CEO would do? And he laughed and he said, yeah, I think they'd still be there, but they wouldn't be as big. And I said, oh, what do you think? They'd be more niche because of the way Danish culture is. And he's like, yeah. And to me, that speaks volumes that we live in one of those societies, a bit like America, where, you know, status and what you do and your standing and how you are compared to the neighbor is so important. And to me, that correlates very clearly with dissatisfaction and stuff like that, as opposed to, you know, it doesn't matter what you do, like we're all okay. We're all have as much value as anyone else. It's all an illusion. And, you know, let's just try and embrace living life in a healthy, holistic way that prioritizes relationships, that prioritizes nature and all those kind of things, rather than this incessant climb to prove our worth and get to the top. Because even when we do get to the top, as we've discussed, the only way is down. So much better to poodle along in the middle and just notice the miraculous nature of mundane life rather than aiming for these crazy highs followed by the crashing lows.
I think on that note, we can we can round it off, Sam. Just remind people about the podcast and the wonderful book that you've written.
Yeah, so the podcast is called A New Way of Being. I've got a YouTube channel which is also A New Way of Being, although I think I am Simon Mundie is the handle. My wife deals with that kind of thing. My Substack as well. And the book is called Champion Thinking. And the paperback's actually out in January. And we've got a really exciting cover, actually, Karl, a new cover. And I've it's different than the hardback, which you may have seen. I think you'll like it. I'll send you a picture. And we changed the subtitle. It's always a bit of a negotiation with the publisher of the scale of Bloomsbury. So it's now what is it? It is Champion Thinking. How to is it let go?
How to improve your memory.
Yeah, but it just speaks sort of how to flipping it. Bear with me, Karl. 1 second. I'm going to look it up. I'll keep prattling on while I do. I'd say this shows you, doesn't it? As I said at the start, we all have our strengths, and it's important to know what they are. And mine is not putting up fences or memory. So it's currently it's how to find success without losing yourself. That's not the one. No, that's also not the one. Oh, blooming heck. Anyway, it's called something else, something like how to. I can't even remember. I'm not. I'll let you know when it's out. But it's about getting past yourself. Anyway, and find peak performance.
The minute we
that's it. You got it. How to get out of your own way to find peak performance.
Right. I just picked.
I was in my own way there, wasn't I?
I picked up from the ether there. It appeared to me.
There we go. If that doesn't show that we're connected, I don't know what does.
It was there all the time. But thanks ever so much, Simon. Thoroughly enjoyed that.
Pleasure, Karl. Thanks for having me.